On the 21st of April 1926, a baby girl was born in London who would one day become one of the most famous monarchs in British history. She was born Princess Elizabeth Alexandra Mary, the first child of the Duke and Duchess of York. At the time, however, her future as queen was far from certain. Elizabeth was born into the British royal family during a period of major change. Britain was recovering from the First World War, and society was beginning to transform. The monarchy remained an important symbol of the country, but nobody could have known how dramatically the royal family's future would change. Her father was Prince Albert, Duke of York, the second son of King George V and Queen Mary. He was known within the family as Bertie. At the time of Elizabeth's birth, he was not expected to become king because the throne was intended for his elder brother, Edward. Elizabeth's mother was Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the Duchess of York. She came from a Scottish noble family and became an important member of the royal family after her marriage to Prince Albert. The birth of Elizabeth brought great happiness to her parents and the wider royal family. She was given the name Elizabeth after her mother, while Alexandra and Mary connected her to earlier generations of British royalty. As a young princess, Elizabeth spent much of her early childhood away from the intense public spotlight. She and her family lived between royal residences and enjoyed a relatively private family life. Her parents wanted their daughters to experience a childhood that included education, family time, and ordinary activities despite their royal position. Elizabeth's early education was largely conducted at home. Private tutors taught her subjects such as history, languages, literature, and constitutional matters. These lessons would later become extremely important because her position required an understanding of Britain, its government, and the responsibilities of the monarchy. Elizabeth also developed interests that would remain with her throughout her life. She loved horses and became particularly interested in riding. She was also known for her love of dogs. These quieter interests gave her a sense of normality despite growing up surrounded by royal duties and public attention. At this stage, Elizabeth was not expected to become queen. Her uncle Edward was the heir to the throne, and her father stood behind him in the line of succession. Elizabeth was therefore growing up as a young princess who had important royal connections, but not as the future monarch everyone expected to watch. No one could have predicted how dramatically Elizabeth's future would change. Within a few years, events inside the royal family would place her much closer to the throne. The quiet little princess born in London in 1926 would eventually become queen, but at the beginning of her life, she was simply a beloved daughter growing up inside Britain's royal family.
Princess Elizabeth spent much of her early childhood in the company of her younger sister, Princess Margaret. Although they had different personalities, the sisters shared a close family life. Margaret was born in 1930, and the arrival of a second daughter brought a new energy to the household. Elizabeth and Margaret grew up surrounded by the traditions of the British monarchy, but their parents tried to give them a calm and protected childhood. Their daily lives included family meals, lessons, outdoor activities, and time spent together away from the largest public events. The sisters spent time at several royal residences, including Windsor and other country homes connected with their family. These places offered large gardens and open spaces where the children could play and explore. Compared with the busy royal ceremonies of London, the countryside provided them with greater privacy. Elizabeth did not attend an ordinary school. Instead, she received much of her education through private tutors. Her lessons introduced her to history, literature, languages, geography, music, and subjects that helped prepare her for life as a member of the royal family. Her education was not limited to books. Elizabeth was gradually taught about the traditions and responsibilities associated with the monarchy. She learned about British history and constitutional government, subjects that would become increasingly important as her position in the royal succession changed. Outside her lessons, Elizabeth enjoyed spending time outdoors. Horse riding became one of her favorite activities, and she developed a strong interest in horses from a young age. Riding allowed her to enjoy the countryside and offered a break from the formal routines of royal life. Elizabeth also enjoyed walking through gardens and playing outdoors with Margaret. The sisters could often enjoy the quieter parts of royal estates away from public ceremonies. These experiences gave them opportunities to grow up with some sense of normal family life despite their unusual surroundings. As Elizabeth grew older, a disciplined routine became an important part of her life. Her days were organized around lessons, activities, family time, and royal expectations. This routine helped her develop habits of punctuality, responsibility, and careful attention to her duties. Elizabeth was generally known as a quiet and reserved child. She was not naturally drawn to unnecessary attention and often appeared thoughtful and serious. At this stage, Elizabeth was still simply a young princess enjoying childhood with her sister. She could not know that the events of the coming years would completely transform her future. The quiet habits and disciplined character developed during these early years would eventually help prepare her for responsibilities far greater than anyone initially expected. For the first 10 years of her life, Princess Elizabeth was not expected to become queen. Her uncle, Edward, Prince of Wales, was the heir to the British throne. As the eldest son of King George V, Edward was expected to succeed his father, while Elizabeth's father, Prince Albert, remained second in line. Edward eventually became King Edward VIII after the death of King George V in January 1936. Elizabeth's position did not immediately change in a dramatic way. Her father was now the king's younger brother, while Elizabeth remained behind her uncle in the line of succession. But Edward's reign soon became surrounded by a major constitutional crisis. He wanted to marry Wallis Simpson, an American woman who had been divorced. At the time, the proposed marriage created serious political and constitutional difficulties for the British monarchy. In December 1936, Edward VIII chose to abdicate the throne. His decision shocked Britain and transformed the future of his younger brother and niece. Elizabeth's father, Prince Albert, became King George VI, placing Elizabeth directly behind him in the line of succession. For Elizabeth, this was an enormous change. She had been growing up as a young princess with no expectation of becoming monarch so soon. Suddenly, she became the heir presumptive to the British throne, and her childhood began to include responsibilities that had previously seemed far away. After her father became king, Elizabeth's education took on a new importance. Her lessons were designed not only to educate her as a young person, but also to prepare her for a future role at the center of the British constitutional system. She began learning more about British history, government, and the traditions of the monarchy. Elizabeth gradually learned how the British constitutional monarchy worked. She was introduced to the relationship between the crown, parliament, and the government. These lessons helped her understand that being monarch was not simply about ceremonies or royal titles, but also about responsibility and public service. Her public responsibilities also increased as she grew older. Elizabeth began appearing at carefully selected public events and royal ceremonies alongside her parents. These occasions gave her valuable experience in meeting officials, members of the public, and representatives from different parts of Britain. Although Elizabeth was still young, she was gradually becoming accustomed to the discipline of royal life. She learned the importance of punctuality, formal appearances, public behavior, and carrying out duties with composure. Her quiet and reserved personality became an important part of the way she approached these responsibilities. The transformation was gradual, but significant. Elizabeth was no longer simply a young princess enjoying a protected childhood. She was now being prepared for a future that could place enormous responsibility on her shoulders. The lessons, ceremonies, and public experiences of these years would become the foundation for the role she would eventually inherit. In September 1939, Britain entered the Second World War after Germany invaded Poland. Princess Elizabeth was only 13 years old when the conflict began. Her childhood suddenly unfolded against the background of air raid warnings, uncertainty, and a nation preparing for a long and difficult war. During the war, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth chose to remain in Britain rather than leave the country. Their decision was intended to show solidarity with the British people. Elizabeth and her sister Margaret also remained in Britain, although they spent much of the war at Windsor Castle for greater safety. Even Buckingham Palace was affected by the dangers of the war. The palace was struck by bombs during German air raids, demonstrating that the royal family was not completely separated from the dangers experienced by ordinary people. These events gave Elizabeth a first-hand understanding of the seriousness of wartime life. Elizabeth and Margaret spent much of their wartime childhood at Windsor Castle. Their lives were more restricted, but they continued their education and daily routines. The young princesses were also aware of the difficulties faced by families throughout Britain, from shortages and blackouts to separation from loved ones serving in the armed forces. As Elizabeth grew older, she began taking a more visible role in encouraging the British public. In 1940, at the age of 14, she and Margaret made a radio broadcast aimed at children affected by the war. Elizabeth's calm voice and message of encouragement helped demonstrate that the young princesses shared the hardships and concerns of the wider British population. In 1940, during the difficult years of the Second World War, Princess Elizabeth made an important radio broadcast. She was still very young, but her voice reached people across Britain and the Commonwealth. At a time when war had created fear and uncertainty, her words brought a sense of comfort and hope. Elizabeth's message was especially meaningful for British children. Many children had been separated from their families or moved away from dangerous cities because of the war. Elizabeth spoke directly to them with encouragement, helping them feel that they were sharing the difficult experience together. The war years were extremely challenging for Britain. Cities faced bombing threats, families worried about loved ones serving in the military, and everyday life was affected by shortages and uncertainty. Elizabeth's calm public presence showed that the young royal family was also standing with the British people during the crisis. The broadcast helped strengthen Elizabeth's public image. People began to see her as more than simply a young princess. Her ability to speak calmly and confidently during a national crisis suggested that she possessed qualities that could become important in her future public duties. For many people, this was an early glimpse of Elizabeth's future role. She was still years away from becoming queen, but her wartime broadcast showed a sense of responsibility and dedication. The young princess had taken an important first step toward becoming one of the most recognizable leaders of Britain. In 1944, Princess Elizabeth celebrated her 18th birthday, an important milestone in her life. Britain was still in the middle of World War II, and her transition into adulthood was very different from that of an ordinary young woman. At 18, Elizabeth was increasingly recognized as an important member of the British royal family and as someone with a significant future role. As Elizabeth entered adulthood, she began taking a greater interest in state responsibilities. She started learning more about the British government and the way national affairs were handled. Elizabeth also gained greater exposure to government officials, public affairs, and royal duties. She observed important meetings and official events and learned how members of the royal family represented Britain. These experiences helped her understand that being a monarch involved much more than ceremonies and traditions. It also required a strong sense of service and responsibility toward the people. During this period, Elizabeth's confidence gradually grew. Her public appearances and increasing involvement in royal duties made her more comfortable speaking and interacting with people. The difficult years of the war had also taught her discipline, patience, and a strong sense of duty, qualities that would become important throughout her future public life. Turning 18 marked another important step in Elizabeth's preparation for her future role. Her training was becoming more serious, covering public service, royal duties, and an understanding of Britain's constitutional system. Princess Elizabeth first met Prince Philip in 1939 when she was 13 years old. Philip was a young prince from the Greek and Danish royal families and was serving as a naval cadet. During World War II, Elizabeth and Philip remained in contact through letters while Philip served in the Royal Navy. Their correspondence allowed them to learn more about each other despite the difficult circumstances of wartime. Over time, their friendship became a serious relationship built on mutual understanding and affection. After their wedding, Elizabeth and Philip began a new chapter of their lives as a young royal couple. Their public appearances attracted considerable attention, and people became interested in their life together and future responsibilities. Elizabeth was still not queen, but her position was becoming increasingly important, while Philip would remain an important part of her journey toward the throne. By the late 1940s, Princess Elizabeth's life was changing in important ways. In 1948, she and Prince Philip welcomed their first child, Prince Charles, and in 1950, their daughter Princess Anne was born. Elizabeth was now balancing family life with the growing responsibilities expected of a future queen. At the same time, King George VI was experiencing serious health problems. As his condition became more difficult, Elizabeth began taking on more official duties. She represented her father at important ceremonies and public events, gradually becoming a more visible figure of the British monarchy. Elizabeth's responsibilities also took her beyond Britain. During Commonwealth tours, she visited different countries, met local leaders, and spoke with ordinary people. These journeys helped her gain valuable experience and strengthened her image as a future leader of the Commonwealth. As her father's health declined, Elizabeth increasingly helped carry out responsibilities that had once belonged to the king. She attended meetings, ceremonies, receptions, and public engagements. With every appearance, she became more confident in the role that awaited her. By the beginning of the 1950s, Elizabeth was no longer simply known as a young princess. She was a wife, a mother, and the heir to the British throne who was increasingly prepared for the responsibilities of monarchy. Yet she could not have known that her moment of succession would arrive much sooner than expected. In early 1952, Princess Elizabeth traveled to Kenya with Prince Philip as part of a Commonwealth tour. The visit was an important royal assignment, and Elizabeth appeared confident as she carried out her duties. At that moment, she was still known as Princess Elizabeth, representing her father, King George VI. While Elizabeth was in Kenya, King George VI's health suddenly became critical. On February 6, 1952, the king died at Sandringham. The devastating news traveled to Kenya, where Princess Elizabeth was informed that her beloved father had passed away. The news changed Elizabeth's life immediately. At just 25 years old, she was no longer simply the heir to the throne. She had become Queen Elizabeth II. The young princess who had traveled to Kenya as a royal daughter now faced the enormous responsibilities of a monarch. Elizabeth returned to Britain to begin her new life as queen. Her accession marked the beginning of a remarkable reign that would span decades of enormous political, social, and technological change. The responsibilities she had gradually learned to carry were now completely hers. The young princess had entered the world as a royal heir, and now she was about to become one of Britain's longest-reigning monarchs. Her journey from a young girl who never expected to become queen to the sovereign of a global commonwealth had reached its defining moment.